won't you say something about D.H. Lawrence?
I met Lawrence during the war, and of course I knew him best later on in the last 4 years of his life, from 26 to 30. He was perfectly extraordinary as a human being. He was extremely fascinating, and he was always stimulating, a little alarming to be with. I mean, because he was he was very fond of my first wife, and we got on very well, and I think we were among the relatively few people with whom he didn't one time or another have a quarrel. We saw, as I say, a great deal of him in the last 4 years of his life.
Why was he always quarrelling?
Well, he was a prickly man, and I don't know. I mean, he somehow did it on principle, I feel. No, I don't know, perhaps that's wrong. I don't know what he... It was a very strange thing. He would sort of burst out in this curious way against people. But it was always a pleasure to be with him and to hear his comments on things, his reactions to nature and so on were always very, very fascinating.
But some of the things he said seemed to me quite horrifying. For example, his resistance to the intellect.
Well, of course, I never understood his anti-intellectualism, all the more so as he was an intellectual. I mean, as a young man, he'd been a great passer of examinations, and he had a great store of knowledge. He didn't really like to say so, but he did. He was very well read. Of course, one of the things I often speculate, what on earth would have happened if he lived on to a reasonable age? It is, of course, it's absolutely extraordinary to think that this man who died at 44 produced this immense volume of stuff which he did, some of which is very fine, I think. I mean, I do think the short stories and some of the long novelettes are most remarkable, and some of the longer novels, I don't think all of them are successful by any means, and some of the later poems I think are very beautiful. But it's amazing to think of all this having been produced by this man who died at 44 and was sick for a great deal of the time. But where would he have gone from the point that he was at when he died? This is a very interesting speculation. I don't think he could have remained where he was, because, I mean, there's a certain ambivalence, even in a book like The Plumed Serpent, where he's inviting us to go back to the dark gods and the blood and so on. But in the next breath he's saying how awful the Mexicans are because they're so slow and unintelligent and so on. I mean, it's a very odd book. I mean, you get the tirades against the Mexicans almost in the terms of an English colonel talking about the natives. In the next breath, you get then these tremendous invitations to sink yourself in the blood. So that there was even then a kind of ambivalence. I think he would have come round to what seems to me a more balanced view. I mean, this whole thing that we have to make the best of both worlds. I mean, both worlds are in us. We have the world of blood and the dark gods. I mean, there was this curious, how many years was it? I mean, well, it was 8 years of wandering between 1918 and 26 when I didn't see him, because he was wandering all over the globe then, hoping to find this kind of promised land, which was obviously not there. I mean, he was very charming generally. I mean, he would sometimes sort of get cross, but he could be very amusing and entertaining. And he was happy. I mean, he was happy sort of sitting on a stone and I mean, very like, remember that poem of Wordsworth, Expostulation and Reply, sitting on an old grey stone, as he says. And of course a lot of his life was spent in this way, and then he would get an urge to write, and then write for 18 hours a day. I mean, it was very extraordinary to see him at work. It was a sort of possession. He would rush on at this, his hand moving at a tremendous rate, and never correct anything, because if he was dissatisfied, he would start again from the beginning. His capacity for perception I mean, it was a great pleasure and instruction, really, to go for a walk with Lawrence. I mean, the sort of way he perceived the world was so intense and exciting. The point is that you must have both. I mean, the blood and the flesh are there, and in certain respects they are wiser than the intellect. I mean, if we interfere with the blood and the flesh with our conscious mind, we get psychosomatic troubles. But on the other hand, we have to do a lot of things with the conscious mind. Why can't we do both? I mean, we have to do both. This is the whole art of life, of making the best of all the worlds. And here again is one of these fatal examples of trying to make everything conform to the standards of only one world, which is perfectly, seeing that we are amphibians, it's no good. These were perverse sides of him, there's no doubt about it. But and I think he would have sort of gradually emerged from this curiously one-sided view of life and attempt to make all life conform to one kind of a pattern. I feel now that, obviously the sensual side of man is of immense importance, but again, this is the question of making the best of both worlds. This is the problem is, how do we get it, reconcile it with consciousness? How do we become fully aware of it? How do we integrate it into our lives? I mean, this is the important problem. And of course, it's interesting to see what has been done historically in this field to achieve precisely this. I mean, this is the interest, for example, of such things as Tantra in India and Tibet. I mean, this is an attempt to find means whereby the spirituality, quotes, can be expressed and discovered in terms of the ordinary processes of life, including the sensual processes. I mean, this to me is the supreme doctrine now. I mean, the whole Mahayana approach of the summing up of the doctrine, which says that nirvana and samsara are one, the world of liberation and the world of appearances are identical, provided you can find eternity within time. I mean, people like Blake knew all about this, and were attempting to do it, and this it seems to me is the essence of the art of life, that discovering these methods of finding, so to say, the absolute in the relative, the timeless in the temporal, the spiritual within the world of sense and matter. And I don't think it's impossible. I mean, I think that this is the whole art of living, which again, this is part of this thing which I feel to be supremely important, of making the best of both worlds, of finding out how to harmonize these disparate elements in the human being. And of course, if you had marriage as an institution and this other thing breaking in and smashing the institution, well then obviously you got into trouble. When passion was completely divorced from marriage and broke up marriage, well then necessarily it seemed a kind of diabolic possession almost. I mean, passion seemed, for all the Greeks spoke about it. I mean, arte in Homer, meaning the state of mind which leads to disaster. In the tragedians, it just means disaster, but in Homer it means the state of mind leading to disaster. And Arte was a daughter of Zeus, whom Zeus, for his own strange and practical joke-like purposes, used to let loose on people. I mean, Arte was the person who blinded Agamemnon into stealing Achilles' girl from him. And when they reconcile, he apologizes and says, "But it wasn't I who did it, it was Arte who did it." And Achilles says, "Yes, of course it was. Arte is really very serious." And if you had this idea, I mean, the sexual passion was just one of the manifestations which this mischievous daughter of Zeus, who could possess you, one of the ones that she imposed upon human beings. They can now blame it, fortunately, on their complexes and the mothers having not weaned them properly or something of the kind. I mean, in fact, it is now the conception of the unconscious, isn't it, that we use instead. But we don't use, you see, what the Freudians don't use is the counterpart in Greek, in Homeric literature, which is menos, which is the divine capacity to do the impossible. You're suddenly filled with this sort of inspiration. I mean, even horses get it sometimes. I mean, a horse gets so much menos that he can gallop along at a terrific rate. And you get it in fighting, you get it in talking with people, and it is perfectly true. I mean, these uprushes of greater, more than normal, almost supernatural powers and capacities which are a fact of experienced life. I think these two conceptions are very interesting, and of course, until you have a clear conception of the unconscious, both on its negative and its positive side, you must have resort to these ideas of supernatural possessions. No, I mean, I think there's a possibility of sexual relations not involving powerful love, but involving sort of friendliness and playfulness. I mean, I think there are many stages of sexual relations which are also quite valuable interpersonal relations, although they may not be of the supremely satisfying quality. But obviously the relationship merely of a man who goes into a brothel and takes the first prostitute is a highly unsatisfactory relation. I mean, but it's possible to imagine relationships short of the highest a great deal more satisfactory than that. I mean, of a kind of many kinds of of relationships which do involve some degree of personal involvement.